Imagine getting your first period, but there are no pads, no tampons, no period tracking app, no internet where she could ask what was happening. Her first period happened in a completely different world. But here's the surprising part. She probably wasn't completely unprepared. Women had been experiencing menstruation for generations before her. So when it finally happened, the experience may not have been completely mysterious. She may already have seen older girls or women dealing with their monthly bleeding. She could have noticed that certain women sometimes needed privacy or extra pieces of absorbent material. So her first period may have been unfamiliar, but not completely unknown. But we need to be careful here. We don't know exactly what every ancient woman used, and there was definitely no single ancient period product. Different communities had different solutions. A woman living in a cold environment could have had very different options from someone living somewhere warm. The materials around them mattered. In some societies, cloth could have been useful. In others, natural plant fibers may have been available. Animal materials may also have been used in some cultures. And sometimes, women may simply have relied on their clothing. The important thing is that we shouldn't imagine one universal method. What worked depended on where you lived and what your community knew. And many of those materials could be reused. Cloth could be washed and used again. Other natural materials could simply be replaced when necessary. The solution wasn't sophisticated, but it didn't need to be. It only needed to work. But what about the actual first period? Imagine the moment she first noticed the blood. She might have been confused. She might have been worried. Or she might have simply wondered, is this normal? And that is where another woman could make a huge difference. She could explain that this wasn't an injury. Her body was simply entering a new stage of development. She might explain what to expect next, how long it might last, and what she could do when it happened again. This kind of knowledge didn't need books. It could be passed directly from one generation to another, and that may have been one of the oldest forms of health education humans ever had. But menstruation wasn't understood through modern biology. Ancient people didn't know about hormones, or ovulation, or the menstrual cycle in the scientific way we understand it today. They simply observed patterns. Women bled periodically. It happened without an obvious injury, and then it stopped. Over generations, women learned how to manage it, and then they taught the next generation. But practical knowledge wasn't the only thing surrounding menstruation. Different societies developed their own beliefs about it. Some may have treated menstruation as completely ordinary. Others created special rules around it. In some cultures, menstruating women may have had temporary restrictions. These could involve religious activities, food, work, or social interaction. But those rules weren't universal. And we shouldn't assume every ancient woman lived by the same beliefs. For some communities, a first period may have marked an important stage of growing up. For others, it may simply have been treated as a normal part of life. But there was another question ancient women had to deal with. What about the pain? Menstrual cramps are caused by the uterus contracting, and that biology is very old. So ancient women almost certainly experienced menstrual discomfort too. But they didn't have modern painkillers. So they had to rely on whatever comfort was available. Rest, warmth, and traditional plant remedies in some cultures. But we shouldn't assume every traditional remedy actually worked. Ancient knowledge was built from observation and experience, not laboratory science. And that difference matters, because ancient women also had another advantage: experience. If something happened every month, you eventually learned its pattern. You learned what felt normal for you, and you learned when something seemed unusual. That knowledge could be passed down again and again. But ancient women probably didn't menstruate as frequently across their entire lives as many women do today. One major reason was pregnancy and breastfeeding. Both can naturally interrupt menstruation for periods of time. Ancient women also lived with very different patterns of nutrition, health, physical activity, and reproduction. That doesn't mean their reproductive lives were better or worse. They were simply different. And there was enormous variation between individuals. So there was never one universal ancient experience of menstruation. And that brings us to something surprisingly relatable. What if she felt embarrassed? Honestly, that part might not be so different from today. Even today, many girls feel awkward talking about their first period. Ancient girls could have experienced those same emotions. But ancient communities had something modern life sometimes lacks: close contact with people who had already experienced it. Women worked together, they lived together, and they could learn from each other directly. Knowledge wasn't hidden inside an app. It was sitting beside you. It was working with you, cooking with you, raising children with you, living through the same biological experiences. That doesn't mean ancient societies were always supportive. Some cultures may have stigmatized menstruation. Others may have treated it as completely ordinary. So the experience depended heavily on culture. But one thing connected them all: their bodies were doing something incredibly old. Menstruation existed long before cities, long before writing, long before modern medicine. And every generation of women had to figure out how to live with it. They didn't have modern technology, but they had something technology can't replace: shared experience. One generation learned, then taught the next. And that simple chain of knowledge may have continued for thousands of years. But there's one big problem with this story. Most of the evidence simply didn't survive. Cloth can disappear. Plant fibers can disappear. And menstrual blood usually leaves very little obvious evidence thousands of years later. That's why historians have to be careful. When someone says, ancient women definitely used this exact material, we should ask, how do we know? Because sometimes there is evidence, and sometimes there is only an educated guess. And that's why the smartest answer isn't pretending we know everything. It's understanding what the evidence actually allows us to say, and what it doesn't. So, how did ancient women handle their first period? Probably through a combination of observation, shared knowledge, available materials, and cultural traditions. There wasn't one ancient solution. There were thousands. A girl might have learned from her mother, her sister, an older relative, or another woman in her community. She may have used cloth, plant fibers, or other locally available materials. She may have had privacy, or she may have lived in a community where menstruation was openly discussed. Either way, women weren't discovering menstruation for the first time. Their communities had already encountered it countless times, and that may have made the first experience less frightening, because she wasn't completely alone. Someone had probably been through it before, and that person could explain what was normal, what to expect, and how to handle it. That's an important detail, because the story isn't really about a mysterious ancient period product. It's about how humans learned to understand their own bodies. And that process started long before anyone could explain it scientifically. They watched, they remembered, they compared experiences, and they passed that information forward. That's how ordinary knowledge can survive without books. And menstruation was just one part of that enormous knowledge system. Ancient women knew which plants grew nearby, which materials were useful, and what their bodies were telling them. And that brings us to the biggest misconception. Ancient women weren't helpless just because they lacked modern technology. They had systems of knowledge of their own. That knowledge wasn't written down. It was remembered through people and repeated through generations. So when a young girl experienced her first period, she may have been entering a world of knowledge that women before her had already built, a world built one experience at a time. And that makes her story much more familiar than it first appears. Because the basic question hasn't changed. What is happening to my body? And someone older could answer. Maybe not with scientific words, but with something just as important. Experience. This happened to me too. You're not alone. Thousands of years ago, that may have been the most important lesson of all. Her body wasn't strange. It was human. And women had been learning how to live with it for generations. If you enjoyed this journey into our past, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more fascinating stories about humanity, history, and evolution. See you in the next story.